I have today with me Mike Anderson, the National Sales Director at 911 ETC, to talk about enterprise E-911 solutions in a consolidated extended network using a Cisco PBX. We're going to give people just another maybe minute here or so. Some of these people, it looks like we're getting a lot of arrivals right on time, so we're just going to pause here for about a minute and we'll get started shortly. Okay, we'll get started here. This is Kevin Kito with 911 ETC, and I just wanted to go over a brief agenda with everybody so everybody kind of knows what we're going to be talking about today on the webinar. We're just going to talk to you a little bit about 911 ETC, why Enhanced 911, go through some of the different states that have Enhanced 911 legislation, talk about the different risk assessments, because maybe there's a chance that you may not even need E911, or maybe your risk is just it's not very high, maybe it's more of a medium risk. IP mobility when it comes to Cisco phones, consolidated extended networks within Cisco, and then the issues and problems that can come up with having a consolidated extended network. And then we'll get into the 911 ETC solution for dealing with those issues when it comes to consolidating extended networks, and also the issues that come up with soft phones and making sure we know where those soft phones are at. So with that said, I'm going to be turning this over to Mike Anderson now. Mike.
Thank you, Kevin. So 911 ETC has been around since 1997. All that we do is enhance 911. That's all we've ever done. What we really specialize in is basically managing the customer's data into the appropriate 911 database, as well as now being able to actually transact those calls in the cloud to the appropriate PSAP. And on top of that, lastly, something that's becoming more and more of an issue lately is nomadic soft phone users and how we would cover those, which I will address in a little bit. Some of the reasons why our customers have implemented E911 over the years, first of all, it's just the right thing to do. Protect your most important asset, which are your people. That's number one. But legal mandates in the various states are now becoming more and more prevalent. More states are enacting some sort of legislation and requiring E911. Unfortunately, the various legislation in the states is not uniform. It varies from state to state, but I'll get into that here in a minute on the next slide. And then the last reason is obviously mitigation of your risk. There's been instances of 911 callers not being able to be found in a timely manner, and lawsuits that have been ensued afterwards. And obviously going to a flattened consolidate extend or consolidating all of your voice into one data center becomes a big issue for E911, as well as now remote workers that can be working from home on a VPN phone or on a soft phone anywhere in the world for that matter. Next slide. So currently, as I mentioned, there's 17 states with E911 legislation. You can get this information on our website at www.911etc.com. And in the red are the states that actually have legislation in place. You can go to our website, as I mentioned, and pull up the actual legislation if your legal department would like to look it over and see what you actually have to do. The ones in light blue, there's no legislation in place, of course. And the ones in dark blue are where we're pending legislation, has not passed yet, but is more than likely going to occur in the next year or so. But as I mentioned, it's always good to go look through this legislation and determine what those requirements are. Something else that a lot of our customers, once they go through this with legal, let's say they have a site in Illinois where there's been a long-standing legislation there. Once they usually go to legal and say, hey, look, we want to address this site, a lot of times legal will come back and say, well, what about the other states? Maybe there's no legislation in place, but if we do address this issue in Illinois, we obviously know there's a problem. And if we don't address it in the other states, they might come after you because something happened because you knew about this, you just chose to ignore it. So that's something that I would really encourage you to talk to legal about and get their input, even though, they might not require it legally, there still is some risk entail in that. So when we talk about risk assessment for E-911, there's different scenarios. And the real low-risk scenario, obviously, is just you have one address, one building, one floor. As you guys are all probably pretty familiar, if you dial 911 and it goes out of PRI or even out of the SIP trunk, generally they'll get just the main billing address. So if you have one address, one building, one floor, they show up to that location and flip on the emergency pretty quickly, and that's not much of an issue. Now, medium risk would be if you have multiple floors. So if you dial 911 and you have not implemented E-911, they will just get your main billing address. So if you're on the 3rd floor and you have 6 floors of that building, they're going to have to search each one of those floors if that person cannot communicate their location. Multiple buildings obviously present the same challenge in that, which building do we arrive at? Is the main billing address, or is it the building next door? And obviously, that applies to obviously on multiple addresses in the same county, because they will only show up to that main billing address. Now, what we're seeing more and more of is just the high risk. Obviously, IT mobility. As phones are moving about within your enterprise, how are you tracking that and conveying that information to the 911 database so the 911 operator knows exactly where they're located, which I will address here shortly. Remote offices that are tied back to a core switch obviously becomes an issue. Work with a lot of healthcare organizations that have remote clinics hanging off their core, even in a couple counties over from where the actual server is sitting. And if they dial 911, they're going to show up to the main hospital, not the remote clinic that's hanging off that core. Home workers, the same situation. How are they going to get the information of where that person is actually sitting rather than where the communication or call manager is located? Soft phones as well. Those can move about all they want. And how are they going to get their new location updated into the 911 database? And what some people call flat and consolidate extend, or consolidating, extending your voice into one core data center and hanging multiple sites off of it, throughout the country. That presents a big challenge, because you'll need to be able to get that 911 call into the appropriate tandem router where that call originated, not the tandem router where the call is leaving the call manager. So some of the terms, some of you might be familiar with, others might not, so just so we're all on the same page here. And ELIN stands for Emergency Location Identification Number. It's strictly just a phone number, and these terms were defined by the National Emergency Number Association, so we're all kind of speaking the same language. But basically, an ELIN is a phone number that we assign to a location or an emergency response location, also known as an URL. The reason why we do that is, in the past, the way 911 database worked is when we would send an update to the 911 database, they wouldn't guarantee that would show up till the next day. So you have to manage those IT phones that are highly mobile within your enterprise. We have to be able to get them that timely information. If we were to try to send an update every time an IP phone moved, by the time that posted to the 911 database, they might have moved again. So what we try to do is set up static locations or URLs and assign an ELIN, or the phone number, to those locations. So if someone moves into that area and dials 911, it will then send out the ELIN that correlates to the location where that user is now sitting. So if you look at this from a diagram perspective, this customer, had a couple floor, a two-story building, and he could actually have 4 zones on that floor. So here you're looking at the first floor, the northwest wing. On the second floor, here's the southeast wing. And they've assigned a unique ELIN to each of these zones or URLs. So if there's 5403 right here on the first floor and the 6874 on the second floor. So if someone picks up their phone or goes in and logs in as their extension on the second floor and then dials 911, what's going to happen is the call manager is going to send out this 6874 to the 911 operator, and the 911 operator will do a lookup into the 911 database and then get the address, second floor, southeast wing. So this way people can move about all you want. Once you set up those zones, there's not a whole lot for you as a customer to update, because those zones are there and people can move about all you want, because your ELINs and URLs are always going to stay static. Now, a question that comes up a lot is that, well, what happens if that person hangs up and they need to call them back? If they're sending out the ELIM, how are they going to get it back to my DID if I dial 911? Well, in Cisco, actually that call, someone calls back that ELIM within a certain amount of time after the call is finished, it will actually then reroute it back to the last 911 caller's DID that dialed 911. So that's all done within the call manager and CER, which I'll be addressing here in a second. So the way we address IP discovery in Cisco environments is we reutilize Cisco's own emergency responder. It's a product that basically does real-time location tracking of the 911 call, or of the users that move about, and it updates the call manager as to which ELIM needs to be sent out as they move about. So if you move to that second floor in that diagram I just showed you, and you plug in your phone, the CER is going to detect you're now on the second floor in the southeast wing, and it's going to update call manager to send out the ELIM that we associated with that location that person just moved to. It also provides notifications internally to security personnel or whoever else you want to be notified. And the great thing about it is once you set this up and get this stood up, there's really nothing to update unless you have a new building or a new location that you want to add to that 911 database. So from a management perspective, once you get this thing CER up and running, it's very easy to administer moving forward. So this is, we call it Consolidate Extend environment here. And then we're seeing more and more of this. In fact, one of our more recent deployments of Cisco and the CER was with a large banking institution that had a core data center down south and a bunch of different locations hanging off of it. In the past, we would have to go contract with a local carrier in every region where you have a phone. So if this is, say, this customer had a couple of data centers and they wanted to set up what we call PS Alley, or getting access to the 911 database, they would have had to put in a local trunk in every one of these sites, New York, DC, Cleveland, Chicago, Vancouver, San Diego. They would have had to go get local trunks, contract with the carrier, and then get access to these various 911 databases, which would be updating to a different area for all of these. With what we call a VPC, or Voice Positioning Center solution, you can now route all your 911 calls to our VPC out of core data center rather than having all those local trunks and those PS Alley agreements we have to establish telcos. That all goes away. Think of it as like a national 911 database. So it's one source of updating to the database, but it's also transacting that call to the appropriate PSAP. So if someone picks up a phone and dials 911 in New York, even though the data center is down here in Atlanta, Georgia, that call will leave Atlanta, hit our voice positioning center. Since we provisioned your ELINs and EARLs in our database, we are then going to route that call into the selective router into New York City, which will then go to the appropriate PSAP, and they will get the address, building, floor, whatever information that you want to present to them. So this is this is a majority of our new implementations are going. It's going away from PS Alley. This gives you flexibility to cover soft phone users, remote workers, remote sites that are hanging off of a core. And another neat thing about this database is it's a near real-time updating process. So as I mentioned earlier, the soft phones, as they move about, we're able to update it in a matter of seconds. It's provisioned in the 911 database. They can dial 911. We can send that call anywhere where that soft phone user resides, anywhere in North America, that is. So some of the problems, though, with consolidating and extending your enterprise into like a core data center is that obviously if that call's leaving that data center and the other site's hanging off of it, that call is going to go out the local PRI or SIP trunk and be delivered to the PSAP nearest to where the data center resides. That brings up a big issue with E-911. So we obviously address that with what we call that voice positioning center solution, and that all the traffic is routed through us, and we will then deliver that call back to where it originated. And in most cases, a PSAP cannot transfer a 911 call to the appropriate PSAP in the event that they dial. So for instance, if someone's in New York City, they dial 911, it goes out that Atlanta, Georgia data center. it hits the PSAP there, they're going to say, I'm sorry, we can't help you. You must pick up another phone, local phone that has a local trunk to get to your PSAP up there in New York City. They won't be able just to transfer that call back to the appropriate PSAP. You know, one actually scenario that the gentleman that works in the 911 industry, he was on a VPN phone a few years back, tied back to a core data center in Ohio. He dialed 911 from New Jersey, and that call actually went to the PSAP in Ohio. And it was actually his daughter that dialed 911 because he was collapsed on the floor. The Ohio PSAP operator told her to hang up, find another phone, and dial 911 locally because she couldn't help her. And so, you know, it seems like not one of those scenarios that would never happen. I mean, this guy was a telecom professional, been working many years in the industry, and you know, when you're in a panic situation, you're going to pick up whatever phone's in front of you, and you're going to use it to dial 911, especially if you're not thinking clearly and you're about to pass out or whatever, you know, might be occurring. So consolidating and extending the enterprise becomes a big issue in terms of E-911 presents challenges, but we do have ways of now addressing that issue quite easily and effectively. Sorry for the delay there. So the way this would look in the enterprise in terms of the whole call completion, we would take, for instance, you can export a file out of Cisco Emergency Responder or CER to an email address. That's the way it was built. In fact, it was originally designed to be able to export that file to a company we call Intrado out of Longmont, Colorado. And they've held the traditional 911 records for all AT&T, everybody but Verizon, basically, and old Pac Bell. But basically, CER was developed to be able to export a file with location of your ELINs and the location of those ELINs in it. So instead of sending it to Intrado, you would obviously export that file to us. We would then load all the information of your ELINs and URLs or phone numbers and their locations into our positioning center. So if someone moves to the second floor, the CER will discover they're on the second floor and update the ERL or the ELIN that should be sent out. That ELIN then will go out to the PBX or the call manager. It can be routed to us via SIP or out of a PRI circuit where we provide an access number that you call forward that 911 call to. That call will hit our voice positioning center, and we'll do a lookup. Since we've already provisioned the location of that ELIN, we then know which selective router to route that call to nearest to where that call originated. The call will then go into the PSAP, go do the DIP, and whatever route associated with that ELIN is where they're going to respond, whatever this address is, second floor, northwest quadrant, whatever that you want to present to the PSAP. At the same time, the CER will allow you to notify internal security or emergency responders internally as to the the phone number and the location that just dialed 911. And that's during the call. It's not when the call hangs up. If some of you are familiar with like old CDR reporting, you couldn't get those notifications until that call was completed. But obviously, if PSAP operators are trained to keep that person on the line until emergency personnel arrive on site. So giving a notification after the call is completed doesn't do you a whole lot of good in that instance. But basically, that's how the call flows. It's as simple as that. We have, as I mentioned earlier, a very large banking customer that we deployed this in less than a month. I mean, they couldn't believe how easy it was because we didn't have to contract with the carriers. We didn't have to worry about local trunking. They just gave us the ELIN URL feed from the CER. We loaded it in the database. We did some testing. Everything worked just fine, and off we went. It's really as simple as that. So the next item I'm going to discuss, and we're going to have time at the end to answer any questions. So if obviously if some of you have some questions I'm not being clear on, and you can ask that as soon as we're finished, which will be in a few minutes. But I did want to address soft phones, which are becoming more and more prevalent. We had a customer come to us, a large financial institution, that said, it's great that we're giving, we had a URL back in the day where a user could go in and update their location to their soft phone, but he said, that's great, but my guys are going to tab through it or ignore it. I want a way to ensure that they're updating their location, not only from the liability standpoint from our organization, but they don't understand that this is important for them too. So basically, what SoftLoc is a client that is loaded on a laptop, and it speaks to what we call an application that's loaded on in the server at the customer's data center, and it allows them to update their location. It'll also disable their disable their soft phone if they try to tab through it and not enter a valid address or location in the database. This can work in a Windows or a Mac environment. Sorry, too far forward. I'm going to be skipping this. So this just shows the notification. So if a user tries to tab through and not put in their location when it prompts them, it'll just say no location set, no voice communication will be permitted until you do so, and it'll terminate the application. So this can work with just about any type of soft phone because it's terminating the application that fires it up. So it's pretty neat in terms of you as an organization have the ability to set this as a feature or it's a setting. You don't have to disable the soft phone, but most of our customers do choose that option. You can deploy the client as an MSI file like you would a software update, so you don't have to go out and touch every single soft phone. You can go in and, as I mentioned earlier, here's the optional force soft phones to clear if no location is specified. You can also allow phone calls if the address cannot be validated, meaning they put in an address that's not a valid address, and the way we can validate an address is to what we call the master street address guide. And when we enter an address into the 911 database, if it doesn't match up exactly with what's in the MSAG or master street address guide, it'll kick it back. We will give suggestions to those people. So if they put in 1555 110th place and city and state, and there's only a 110th street, we will come back and say, did you mean 1555 110th street? Because this is not a valid address. So we'll give them suggestions as well, and you can go in and edit all your callers. You can go in and look as an administrator what callers are provisioned. Basically anything you'd want to know as an administrator, what's going on. Now the way this architecture looks is this client that's loaded on the laptop will speak then to the application back at your data center. So when they update their location, the application then will basically connect to our data center and update our data center, our database, as to the location of that soft phone. This takes anywhere from 3 to 5 seconds once they hit submit. So this speaks to an application on your site. It can be on a virtual machine or a physical server, and then this application speaks to our data center, which updates the actual location. Some of the advantages of using a VoIP Connect solution is it's just one cloud-based solution for Cisco. You don't need multiple, as I mentioned earlier, multiple PS Alley contracts with various carriers. You don't need local trunks or local PRIs to make this work. We utilize an underlying carrier that's called Bandwidth. Basically, everybody out there that does E-911 is utilizing one of 3 underlying carriers to actually transact that call into the appropriate PSAP. We use Bandwidth, which has a fully enabled IP environment and is poised to do next generation, or what we call NG911, which means we'll actually be sending URI or URL information in a SIP header directly to the PSAP, which then they can click on that URL and get floor plans, fire zones, maybe heat sensors into the buildings if there's a fire. So we'll be able to provide a lot more information to those PSAPs when NG or Next Generation 911 becomes available. But the way that call will be routed, we'll be using what we call a voice positioning center type solution. That call will be routed in the cloud via SIP into the PSAP. Another neat feature is that we can obviously cover remote workers, soft phone users, highly nomadic soft phone users now, and for quite inexpensively. I've been doing this for 12 years now, and back in the day, this was a lot more labor and manual labor intensive. But in terms of setting up the ELINs and EARLs, once you deploy this and get it up and working, there's really not much for you to do in terms of a day-to-day management of it. And we can do this very affordably. The costs have definitely come down over the years in terms of what it would cost a large enterprise to deploy E-911. Okay. Got a little bit of latency here. So As I mentioned earlier, we're a Cisco developer partner. We have many large customers. We're deploying a very large E-911 deployment for a CER, financial institution customer with over 250,000 phones. And, this is basically our customers tell us the easiest way to deploy it, the quickest way to deploy it, and the easiest to manage it moving forward. So we're constantly working with Cisco to better our solutions. Right now, I don't see any gaps really, but as we get towards next generation of NG911, things will start changing a little bit in terms of what information is delivered to the 911 operator and what our options are. Right now, most of the PSAPs, there's only a few in the United States that can actually receive NG911 information, but probably in the next 5 years, it'll be more and more prevalent throughout the United States. And I believe that was the last slide. Yes, it was. So with that being said, we'll take any questions that anybody has right now, and I'll answer them the best that I can.
All right, thanks, Mike. Yeah, I got a question here. Does your solution require redundant servers in case the primary server goes down?
Absolutely. On the customer site, I would say no, and on our site, we do have redundancy built into our network for sure. So for us, it's not an issue. Now, if for them, the server redundancy would only be if something goes down. We're not really getting an update every day if we're doing CER. Once you set up those values of the evens and earls, that's pretty much set. So it's not like we're getting an update every day from a customer. Well, I mean, we can, but most of our customers only send us a file when they are adding a new location, or in some cases they'll just send us an update once a month just to make sure anybody changes anything in the system. We'll just compare from the previous update. If everything's the same, fine, we'll ignore it. If there's something different, we'll extract it out and make sure that database is current and accurate.
Hey, Mike, I actually have a follow-up question to that. The question is, see how this is worded here. I've looked at another E911 solution, and they require me to purchase 2 redundant servers for call delivery. That's what they're talking about.
Yeah, high availability. I know what solution you're referring to, and they do require that. I understand that. The reason why is because they're in the call path, which is something that we don't feel comfortable doing, because if something goes down, you lose 911 capability. That for their solution, yes, they do require 2 servers. With ours, if you use CER, no. But I always thought charging for high availability is a little bit, I don't know. If you're only using one instance at a time, it doesn't seem fair to charge for both, but that's just the way they do it. I'm sorry, I can't give more insight, but that's just their decision, obviously, not mine.
Okay, next question is, do you have an alternative to Cisco Emergency Responder?
Not at this time. Just like I said, because we're a developer partner with Cisco, we chose not to compete with them on this. We do have some Cisco customers, though, that don't use CER, and they have a very extensive move, add, change process that everyone has to follow. So they're able to control that. I mean, it's theoretically they can't, but they seem to have a good handle on when people do not move their phones unless they notify their department that's in charge of that. So, but we do have a number of fairly good-sized customers that don't use CER, but there's some challenges there. If people start moving their phones without telling you, then you got problems.
Okay, I think that may be it for questions. If anybody has any questions, just feel free to go into that little bar on the right-hand side, type them in there. Otherwise, I think we might be able to just end it.
Yeah, and we'll be sending a copy of this presentation for anybody that would like it, or an audio recording of the whole presentation. So if you needed that, please just let us know.
Okay. Sounds good. And thanks again, Mike. And like Mike said, we'll be sending this out to everyone who attended. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.